Hello and welcome to the Fire Protection Association's Assembly Point podcast. I'm Jonathan O'Neill, I'm Managing Director at the FPA, and today I'm joined by Chris Miles, the Regional Business Director for Underwriters Laboratories Built Environment Business. Chris, thanks for joining me today to explore building safety and what we can learn from the global world of fire testing in the UK. Obviously, it's not long since we last saw each other, as we were both together at FireX last week in London. It was a great opportunity, of course, to meet with our members, customers, and the wider fire safety sector again. I thought it was a very, very positive event, certainly from FPA's perspective, and to get the sector together. What was your feelings and feedback of the event, Chris?
Yeah, hi John. It was super to see so many people in real life after what seemed like so long without such events. It felt like the ability to properly discuss issues that were facing the industry was now kind of back on track. And even though, I know discussions have been ongoing through the pandemic years, it's clear that there's still a lot of fire safety issues facing the country that are still there and still need kind of clear paths forward, so that we can get to some resolutions. FireX strangely seemed to hit that home to me with all the presentations that were going on and all the discussions we had. There's still a lot to get done.
A loads to get done. 5 years on from Grenfell Tower. And, going back to Judith Hackett's initial report, she clearly identified in her independent review of the building regulations and the fire safety, there was a need for a clear, more transparent and more effective specification and testing regime for construction products. Now we've seen the Building Safety Act. It's now received royal assent. Do you think we're achieving this?
Firstly, 5 years, how quickly has that gone? It's frightening, and frankly, no, I'm not sure we really have moved that much closer to the ideal system for construction products, at least from a fire safety perspective. I was involved in the data gathering process for that government-sponsored research into the topic of the testing regime. Conducted by Paul Morell, and this was supposed to be complete and issued by now, but it seems like that might never see the light of day. I was very hopeful that would provide a direction for change for the testing regime. There are some things moving, but still without conclusion. I mean, we've got the Code for Construction Product Information, CCPI, which should help organisations drive higher standards, at least in the presentation of product information, and that was something that the Hackett report recommended. The expectation from that code is for construction products to be supported by, I think, clear, accurate, up-to-date, accessible and unambiguous information, and that would be a big step in the right direction. But I know it's delayed, but it's going in the right way. Competence, I think, is still a big issue within the construction sector. And while there have been many hours talked about developing a set of criteria or conditions, they've still not been embedded into any sort of requirement within the industry. Many organisations, including the Association for Specialist Fire Protection, for which I'm currently chair, have developed and operate training now and provide qualifications in fire safety. And they're a major boost now, a major asset for people to get the skills and knowledge needed, but they're not compulsory and not a minimum level or embedded into the industry. I also think, post Grenfell, we've had Brexit, and I had hoped that would provide us with some sort of opportunity to be more focused on the GB requirements, at least, if not Northern Ireland, and provide government with the opportunity for better governance of construction products. But so far we've retained the European system and actually added additional burdens for industry, such as the UKCA marking, which had little, if any, technical value. I think that's a missed opportunity. You mentioned, as Hackett did, a clearer, more transparent, more effective specification and testing regime. So far, I'd say we're not really there. I know the government intends to get there, but seems to have not progressed enough at this stage. And just before we finish on that, and I'm sure we'll get onto it later on, but Dame Judith mentioned the need to be transparent with test results, expecting that this would close some gaps in what's used in the market, providing safer products. And as someone who's spent nearly all of my working life in and around test facilities, I don't see that as a way to solve the concerns over a more robust testing regime. Publishing failed results isn't the solution. There's better ways of doing that.
We'll come on to that. I'm really fascinated to hear your comments about where you are, and particularly where ASFP think how the situation lies at the moment. But do you think, how much of that do you think is down to a misunderstanding from the civil servants over the three government departments of how the system currently works and how it should operate in the future? Have they consulted industry enough?
I think recently, John, I've seen that process starting to take hold. That they run some regular workshops now and trying to get feedback from them. As I say, OPSS do, at least, that I've seen. I firmly believe there's a desire for them to do good things and to do it properly. I'm not sure the structure of the civil service really helps that. Clearly they need some guidance, but I don't know that they listen enough and are willing to accept the guidance that's offered for them. I think there's more that we could do to work together. I mean, between industry and the government departments to look at fire safety and take on board some of the recommendations.
How much do you think that the industry is waiting for the government to act? I mean, Hackett was very, very clear that actually the solutions lie within the industry itself. Do you think that the industry should be taking a far more proactive approach and actually getting on the front foot and telling government what needs to be done?
Yeah, great question. Yes, but it's so, and Hackett pointed this out, and I remember towards the back of the report there's a chart showing all of the bodies and organisations involved, and it's a minefield. We're so disparate, the construction industry is so disparate, that to expect it to come together and sort itself out is really probably at best naive. It needs a driver to do that, and we all hoped that the Building Safety Act would be that driver, and it may yet be, but it's taken too long to bring to fruition. I would like industry to be doing more itself, but it's perhaps too much to expect for that to happen.
So, obviously, which we've talked about testing, what we haven't talked about is certification, independent third-party certification. Clearly, the government are still to be convinced that it needs to be made mandatory. Where is the industry in actually taking forward independent third-party certification itself?
Well, certainly bodies like the FIA and like the ASFP recommend or insist on third-party certification of products, and in some cases installers when they're involved with fire safety products, but that's not embedded deeply enough into the industry. The construction side of the industry needs to embrace that. I know there's discussion about it, but I thought the adoption of a building safety manager in conjunction with the building safety regulator as part of the chain of approvals was a great step forward towards improving the flawed system as it's described. But that building safety manager's now been withdrawn. To me, that's a backward step, and I wonder if it's actually in the residents' interest either. Just looking specifically at certification, and UL's been a certification body for well over 100 years, and working for UL as I do, I'm bound to say that I'm a firm believer in the benefits of third-party certification, but I really am. If I can maybe just explain why. We've seen that the information that's used to support products placed on the market can be misused. That's now without doubt, and it harks back to that recommendation for a more transparent system of testing. Both of those types of concerns can be addressed and removed by using third-party certification for products. That would introduce the involvement of an independent body such as UL in the whole process of getting products to market, from manufacturer to installation and possibly beyond, possibly into ongoing maintenance. I'm kind of at a loss to understand why government hasn't yet grasped those benefits, and actually especially in a post-Brexit environment where we meant to be taking back control. The certification of installers of fire safety products would provide a significant step forward for the overall system, and ensure that certificated products are not undermined by incorrect installation. But I've got to add that certification for products and installers has to be at the right level and a consistent level, and shouldn't be an easy bar to get over. It shouldn't be done based on a commercial need. It should be a technical need, and that means there's got to be some sacrifices by the parties involved in order to get to the required quality level. And I actually believe those levels should be set by government and not open to individual conformity assessment bodies to set our own requirements. I think that's really easy for government to get done. I think there's a will to do it within the conformity assessment bodies, and if government would engage with us, I think they'd be pushing at an open door.
As you know, I'm a big believer in independent third-party certification, and always have been. The insurers, as you know, have been specifying independent third-party certification products and services for very, very many years. But I wonder, has the industry done enough to convince the enforcing authorities, the new building safety regulator, building control, fire and rescue services, and the specifiers, the consulting engineers, the architects, the building owners, of the benefits of third-party certification and their compliance with legislation if they go down that route?
I mean, clearly we've not done enough, because it's not been taken up yet and not adopted. Your question is, can we do more? For sure. But I think it goes back to, do people want to listen? Do people want to embrace that higher level? I think in some cases that makes making a building, putting a building up, that makes it more difficult, probably more costly. So you can understand why people don't really want to adopt it unless there's a firm requirement. The firm requirement, I suppose, is that we put safe buildings up. But again, the disparate nature of the construction industry, people not really wanting to listen, all of these things kind of don't help the adoption of certification across the board, unfortunately.
I do agree with you, but I do think that there's more we need to do to convince the other stakeholders in the process of the benefits of
such as what, John? What could be done?
Well, if I look at some of the activities of the organisations such as BAE, for example, whenever they see a tender going out that involves schemes that they're involved with, they get involved. They get in touch with the tenderer and say, actually, do you know what? Why aren't you specifying third-party certificated products here? And more often than not, they have success in actually making sure that that is a requirement for the tender going forward. And I wonder whether the certification bodies and the trade associations could do more in that region to start to convince, and we would start to see third-party certification being specified as the norm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Possibility. I mean, obviously, we've looked a little bit about at what's happened in the UK, but obviously from UL's massive international experience, you're working with the international building codes which require listing. Do you think there is an opportunity for us to learn from the international experience that you guys have got and bring those systems into the UK? And if so, what would be changed from the systems that we have at the moment?
Yeah, so you're correct. I've worked for UL and we've been involved in product certification, as I said, for 100 years and headquartered out of the USA, although now a global organisation, deeply involved in the codes in North America, including the International Building Code, the IBC, as you said. And many of those codes in North America require what they refer to as listings. To us, that means certification of the product. It's convenient to say listings. And there's absolutely no doubt, John, that there are aspects of some international practices which in the UK we could learn from, we could use to provide a more robust system for construction, especially for fire safety. It's a requirement in the IBC, the International Building Code, that fire safety products are certificated, are listed, and that brings many of the advantages we talked about before. It requires the involvement from start to finish of an independent body such as UL to oversee the production of the test samples, so what you actually test. It requires the involvement that we check on factory production, and UL does that as a minimum of 4 times a year as unannounced visits to the place of production. The listing of that product or system includes the scope of use, and in doing so, the limitations of use. It's a critical part of the certification that test evidence that supports that scope is conducted under the control of the certification body. That prevents a manufacturer from testing and testing and testing until the result is acceptable, and then using only the successful test result. If UL wasn't involved in the sampling of the test samples or in the subsequent testing, the results of that test can't be used in the certification of the product. So that addresses Dame Judith's comment about the need for publication of all test data. We've seen a big uptake of requests for test reports since Grenfell, but I think that misses the point raised in building a safer future report, because sponsors can still keep testing until an acceptable result is achieved and then just use that one report. Product certification, as required by the IBC, doesn't encourage the use of test reports in isolation. Testing is a means for the certification bodies to get data on the product when it's tested. It's a means to an end, not the end in itself. So I think just that one simple thing, adoption of certification as done by the IBC, would be a big step forward to address many of Dame Judith's points on the testing regime tidy up, so to speak.
Some of the criticisms that we've seen come out post Grenfell around standards and how we put those test specifications together have been about the dominance of certain sectors within those standards committees. My understanding is that internationally, and particularly in the United States, there's a requirement to have a balance within the committee structure. Do you think we would benefit from that in the UK, particularly involving stakeholders who are possible on the periphery at the moment and would possibly see the benefits of testing and third-party certification if they were more engaged in the process?
Within North America, there's a number of standards writing bodies, not just like we have in the UK, one under BSI, and UL is one of those standards writing bodies. So we write standards, generally test standards, and I've seen it firsthand, John, when we have what we call a standards technical panel, STP, that we have to maintain that balance. Actually, it's a UL standard, but UL gets one position on that, or one vote on that technical panel, and that's balanced by other certification bodies or test bodies. And I've had many requests from our customers, manufacturers generally, to get on the standards technical panels, and unless there's a balance by somebody that's not a manufacturer, so from another stakeholder sector, they can't get on, and they might be our best customer, but unless it's balanced, they aren't allowed onto the STP. And an adoption of something like that would address that bias that often occurs because big manufacturers are able to support such activity, and small bodies like, I don't know, residents organisation, for instance, don't have the resources to spend on such committees, and as a result, the document can get skewed.
Hopefully, with practices changing as they have post COVID, and more meetings online, and it's not having to physically be at British Standards Committee meetings, maybe there is an opportunity for British Standards to look at its the makeup of its committee structure going forward, and we could start to see maybe a mirroring of the situation that you've got in the States, and I think that would lead to a far more transparent system, and I think and address many of the issues that Dame Judith raised in her initial report.
Yeah, I agree, but that's really for as far as standards writing goes, and the regulations are probably a different animal and organised in a different way, but there's for sure things that we can learn about how to produce our regulations, how to maintain, and critically how to change them when we need to, when we see an event like Grenfell. Our regulations still haven't changed massively apart from one or two areas, yet if it was the International Building Code, it would have been rewritten a number of times already, probably.
And it's interesting, because that brings me to another point. We've talked about modern methods of construction, of the highly engineered approach that we're seeing to construction these days. How do you think third-party certification can actually be brought in to the finished built environment? Do you think it's got a role to play?
It's definitely got a role to play, and sure, with the green agenda and the drive still for cost-effective builds, that requires materials and systems and methods which are different from what we're used to. And when it comes to dealing with fire events, we're faced with new requirements in preventing spread within buildings and between buildings, and I do worry about the firefighters when they go to these types of buildings that are perhaps used to dealing with traditional materials and methods, and those highly engineered buildings for sure present many new challenges across our current processes. If we look at modular buildings, for instance, designed to be built off-site and craned in and fixed together for speed on-site, there's numerous concealed spaces in there which are heavily reliant upon barriers within those cavities. There are products which are designed to work in those situations, but the inspection regime, the overall governance of the build off-site, and when it comes to site, it isn't ideal. It doesn't provide a robust end state building. I think in many cases, especially during the construction phase, and probably applies in the occupation stage as well. So the inspection and certification of the final building, the whole building, is probably something that we would benefit from. I know it's an additional burden on industry and a cost, and probably slows up the whole process, but it's important. I would hate to see one of these buildings resulting in some type of Grenfell, but for modern methods of construction. The drive for deregulation over years, perhaps with the best intentions, certainly hasn't helped create a system to be the best we possibly can. And I think that comes down to not having a lead authority in quality in construction. Maybe the building safety regulator can help with that, but I don't know that they can be a lead body to show what good practice should be. Insurers have a part to play as well, I think, and I know again they've got the best intentions, but as a driver, perhaps they could help us more.
I certainly think there's a lot of interest from the insurance industry, and maybe we can learn something from the international building codes, particularly with modern methods of construction. As you quite rightly point out, 5 years since Grenfell, and we still haven't had much change to our building regulations. And if we are in a situation where we are struggling to keep up with modern methods of construction, maybe we should, that happens in other countries, rely on codes such as the International Building Code, which is renewed regularly and does look at modern methods of construction on a regular basis, and puts in sensible controls for those building methods. Chris, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really, really valuable. Your insights from an ASFP perspective and from UL's, really, really interesting and stimulating an awful lot of debate at the moment. I'm now going to hand over to Howard Passey and Marcus Rees, and they're going to have a discussion on the value of a fire strategy when it comes to building safety. Chris, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. And Chris, that was a really interesting discussion. Hello, I'm Howard Passey, Director of Operations at the FPA, and for the second part of today's podcast, we will be looking at the benefit offered by a fire strategy when designing, constructing, refurbishing or managing a premises fire safety. I'm joined today by Marcus Rees, the FPA's lead on fire strategy. Marcus, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking time out of a very busy schedule. As we know, a fire strategy can be seen as serving a multitude of functions. It should be fundamental to the day-to-day management of fire safety in premises and needs to be specifically tailored to the building. Looking at Approved Document B, there's plenty of guidance that will deliver a compliant building. The guidance is performance-based, and achieving equivalence to the functional requirements should deliver a reasonable level of fire safety. Fire safety legislation such as the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order in England and Wales and similar legislation in Scotland and Northern Ireland requires arrangements to be made and a fire risk assessment to be carried out. So the question is, does meeting both or either of these requirements deliver a fire strategy?
Well, thanks for having me, Howard, firstly. Interesting question. Simply put, no, it doesn't. Obviously, it is correct that you have to complete a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment to satisfy the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. The fire strategy is the overarching document that sets the foundation for ongoing fire risk assessments, any consultation works, any building refurbishments. What it does is it removes the requirement to go back to first principles every time you want to do something to that building. So you've got your baseline information that you can always refer back to. As an example, if we look at the means of escape in a building, the fire strategy is there to sort of detail the means of escape that are going to be used by all the occupants, the the maximum capacities, stairway widths, stairway heights, how many people can use those stairways, and any works that are carried out to that building need to take into consideration these arrangements.
So those decisions are made during the design of the building. Is that right? That's what you're saying in terms of occupancy numbers and capacities for staircases and such like.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, there's two types of fire strategies that we can develop. It'd be a design phase fire strategy, which goes through multiple stages of approval, or secondly, once a building's already constructed, then we can do what we call an as-built fire strategy, or as-built fire safety strategy, which would look at an existing building, which is a little bit tricky in that we need to look at the history of that building in order to understand why it was built the way it was. Obviously, when you've got a 200-year-old building, you're trying to find out the construction date and sort of the rationale behind the existing design. That is, it takes a lot of work and a lot of investigation, and you sometimes feel like a historian when you're scrolling through those documentation. But yeah, that's the different types of fire strategy we can deliver.
Okay, so you're almost, I suppose, with that retrospective or as built, you're almost reverse engineering the building to a certain degree.
Essentially, yeah. You're trying to ascertain why the designers and the developers have gone the route that they have, scrolling through a lot of repealed information, documentation that would have been relevant at the time of construction, but not necessarily making sense right now. So yeah, current methods, we look at sprinkler system design, but 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago, there was a different rationale behind installing the system in such in an area or a high risk area. So we're trying to bring old standards in line with current standards.
Okay, well, that does bring me on very nicely to the next question, which is really about the information requirements, I suppose, to a certain degree. We know that within the current building regulations, they require contractors to provide fire safety information to their clients post-construction. And I'm thinking here of Regulation 38, for example. However, in my experience, not necessarily doing fire strategy work, but certainly with fire risk assessments, this information is rarely available, or if it is available, it's not in a usable format. However, there is little advice available to the likes of you and I as to how such information is collated and presented. And if we don't know how it's meant to work, then I presume that the contractors might also struggle in terms of understanding how to present that information in a usable way. Given that this will apply to the vast majority of the built environment, is it possible to pull construction information and fire risk assessment findings together to form a fire strategy? And if so, what kind of process do you go through?
Again, this, it is a misconception that pulling bits of information that already exist into a document essentially will create a fire strategy, but that's not the case. I mean, you mentioned Regulation 38, and that's been around since the approved document, and it's very rare that we find the required information. And the fire risk assessment and the construction information and the management information for that building, it all goes towards forming that sort of end user as built fire strategy, or retrospective fire strategy as we refer to it sometimes. But it's not as straightforward as just paper clipping that information together and sort of passing it on to the end building user. There's a lot of steps that need to be considered and taken. And as we mentioned just now about looking for historical information about these buildings, a lot of the time it doesn't exist. So we want to provide the client with accurate, up-to-date information, but unfortunately, it's really difficult to get that.
Last week we saw the introduction of the Building Safety Act. Do you think we'll see any difference in the information provided by contractors as a result of the new requirements in that piece of legislation?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Since the development of these new acts and the Hackett Review, the golden thread of information has been, sort of out there in the industry, and is going to be the benchmark for retaining and managing that information. And it's a step further than the Regulation 38, where, yeah, people understood that it was a requirement to have that information, but there was no sort of consequence for not having it. And I think the golden thread gives the industry and the wider building industry the opportunity to, enforce this, put the responsibility onto the building responsible person or relevant person, and make them accountable for that information. And I think that's a really important takeaway.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that might provide what we would recognise as a fire strategy then? Do you think it will be formed in such a way?
No, I think there's a multitude of places that this information can be retained, and different formats, such as a safety case, through the fire risk assessment process, building management systems. There's a lot of areas where this information can be retained, but it's got to be digital.
Moving on and just thinking a little bit now about the strategy content. I know we've talked a bit about the sort of the process and the difficulties there might be in assessing the right information, certainly when doing retrospective work. But when speaking with local fire and rescue services, they indicated that without a compartmentation strategy, it would not be possible to complete a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment for certain types of premises. Does a compartmentation strategy deliver the same information as a fire strategy?
No, again, that's another misconception that we're finding. When you go to site and you ask for the fire strategy, you sometimes get a plan of the building which has got some red lines or blue lines marked on it, and they say, well, that's your fire strategy, and it's not. That's a very small subsection of a fire strategy. Yes, it's great to have a compartmentation strategy, and absolutely a fire risk assessment can't be considered suitable and sufficient without considering compartmentation and how fire is going to spread through the building. But no, it doesn't form a fire strategy. It does form part of it. I think maybe 1 out of 10 sites would have that information available. So what we usually have to do is, when we arrive to site, we get plan drawings if they're available, mark up the lines of compartmentation against the relevant guidance or documentation that we're referring to, whether it be ADB or BB100 or 9999, and then that would form a subsection in place.
Okay, so looking beyond, I suppose, those functional requirements within approved document B, I presume that moving through the strategy, you've then got to consider things like how the building's going to be managed, maintenance requirements, evacuation procedures, and those sorts of things as well. Is that right?
You do. You're correct. You've got the fire evacuation procedure that's relevant to that building or set of buildings, and where we've got 3 or 4 interconnecting buildings, for instance, they may have various fire evacuation procedures, and then we need to come up with an overarching strategy that would bring those together to ensure that should a fire breach a compartment wall into the neighbouring building, then they can be evacuated safely also. Management of a building, extremely important. Again, that's another subsection. Things like a gap analysis, where we look at, this is the standard from where the building was designed, this is the standard of the day today, where the gap is in the middle and actions need to be raised. The gap analysis would provide an overview of those actions.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, I suppose, because I think you're more than likely, as we find with most fire risk assessments, you're always going to find things that you maybe are not content with, or potentially that the building owner or occupier has has their own design criteria in mind in terms of an evacuation strategy. So I suppose that in pulling the strategy together, you can offer them the benefit of explaining what they need to change in order to get to where they want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
So
no, go on. Sorry.
no, I was just going to ask about the benefits. I think it's fairly evident that bringing all of that information together is at least going to give you that, one-stop spot to go to for anything fire safety related. And you'll always have something which describes exactly what's meant to be happening at any particular point in time, certainly with regard to systems maintenance and such like. But do you think it brings other benefits further down the line for the building owner and occupier?
Yeah, I think it creates an opportunity for that building to be managed effectively. One of the more significant issues that I've seemed to come across is refurbishment and alteration of buildings. Now, plans are provided, the contractors move in, and that's it. It's demolition derby time. But the reality is that we need to maintain these buildings to the standard that they've been designed to, whether that be structural fire resistance, whether it be load bearing, non-load bearing walls, fire stopping, compartmentation, breaching compartment floors. All of these factors are reducing the integrity of that building or the overall performance that that building is designed to provide. So by giving this information to the responsible person, it's giving them an overview of what their building should be doing and how that should be managed moving forward.
So if they punch a hole in a floor, they'll know what fire resistance the floor is meant to achieve, or if they're extending the building, they'll know what standard of fire alarm system or category of fire alarm system they have to achieve to suit the existing strategy. Okay. Obviously, talking about legislation, building regulations, regulatory reform, fire safety order and such like, their primary focus is on life safety and quite rightly so. However, I know that some research undertaken by Risk Authority that is administered by the FPA found that over a 10-year period, the average large loss for fires in the UK was a little over £650,000 per incident, which seems a huge amount. And we also recognise the devastating effects that a fire can have on individuals, can have on communities through the loss of a workplace or a community facility such as a school. Is there a mechanism whereby we can guard against this, ensuring better protection is afforded to property and business through the fire strategy? And if so, how would we go about that?
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's a shocking figure. When we're carrying out our as-built fire strategies, I know the primary focus has always been life safety, but we do work towards property protection and insurers' requirements in addition to those life safety requirements. And I think you've mentioned schools, which is a really important fact there. Obviously, the building bulletin has moved towards any new building, any new school building or extension to a school has to be sprinkler protected, following the risk assessment and cost benefit analysis. So there is an emphasis on property protection and working within the fire strategy sort of sector. That's where we need to be focused as well as life safety, because as you said, it's not only financial implications, it's there's sentimental value to people's personal belongings or to a property, or where we find historical buildings, there's there have been salvage plans in place which supplemented insurers' requirements, and we're moving towards compartmentation, enhancement of compartmentation, or active fire safety systems in order to protect those valuable assets. Or I think there's a lot of ways that we could move to look at property protection, but I don't think there is a simple answer without looking at cost implications.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Marcus, again, for taking some time out of a busy schedule to join me on the podcast today, and for sharing some really interesting thoughts and insights. Thanks very much.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.